From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Hordern, I'm Joe Matthew.
Volatility takes a breather after UBS agreed to purchase Credit Suisse over the weekend. The big question, how is the U.S. banking sector holding up now?
I'm calling for an independent investigation of the Fed and the whole regulatory system here. The Fed doesn't just get to do its own investigation.
Should the FDIC's $250,000 insurance limit be expanded more broadly? That question circulating the halls of Congress. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, member of the Banking Committee, joins us.
China's President Xi visiting Moscow and Vladimir Putin today, with Xi saying there's room for the two countries to expand cooperation. We'll dive into this with our political panel.
And President Trump's bombshell. He says he'll be arrested tomorrow in connection with alleged hush money payments to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. We'll discuss who stands to benefit from a Trump indictment and who doesn't. Joe, what a 72 hours we've had, not even 48 hours, 72 hours. We ended on Friday with this idea that UBS was potentially going to go in for parts or all of Credit Suisse. They got it done before Asian markets opened. The finger pointing in Zurich was at the U.S. banking sector.
Yep,
and then over the weekend, the Sunday shows, it was all about finger pointing here, about who was responsible for the contagion in the U.S.
All over sector again. And First Republic, remember, we went into the weekend with the dust still settling, the ink still drying on this deal to rescue the bank. That's been thrown up in the air all over. And there does seem to be a feel of getting back to the fear that we had last week, almost like none of that ever happened.
Yeah, exactly. And now it's the blame game in Washington. Who is responsible and what should happen because of that? Interesting
to consider that, since lawmakers still don't exactly know what happened. Joining us now around the table, Bloomberg's Deputy Managing Editor for U.S. Government and Economics, Wendy Benjaminson, back with us here on Balance of Power, along with Bloomberg's SEC reporter, Ben Bain. It's great to see you both here. Ben, things clearly not feeling a lot better, if we can start here, than they were on Friday. And quite a bit has transpired. The uncertainty seems to be just relentless here. And the conversation is crystallized around FDIC insurance and whether something can happen. Can the agency continue to temporarily back all deposits while Congress figures out a path?
That's right. So that has really been one of the biggest political issues that's emerged from this whole crisis. The idea of whether what transpired with these two failed banks, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, where essentially the government stepped in and said not just deposits under $250,000 can be insured and essentially made whole, but every deposit can be. The government stepped in and did that. And what that's done is that's created a desire in various corners of the political spectrum to actually do that more broadly. Now, it's not that easy. Essentially, Congress will need to step in here effectively and pass some kind of resolution to really do that on a broad basis. And that's not an easy thing to do in this Congress. Most things are not easy to do in such a divided political situation right now. So that's where we are.
Wendy, your take? Is this just throwing spaghetti at the wall, what sticks with constituents? Or could they actually lift this threshold? If we're going to do it to stop contagion, they need to do this soon.
They would need to do it soon, although this is Washington in 2023. Nothing's going to happen soon. And it seems like both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue are waiting for the other side to throw something at the wall. Congress today, there was the press briefing with Karine Jean-Pierre, and she was very sort of don't have anything to say on this. We're waiting for Congress. And meanwhile, Congress, both Senate Leader Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy are both sort of saying, well, we'll see what the White House and the regulators want to do. So we really don't know where we are. There is one area of common ground, which is what they love having a little catchphrase, clawing back the bonuses or other compensation from the failed bank executives. Both sides seem to agree on that. Everything else, no.
Ben, it's interesting to note that President Biden issued his first veto today. It was a Republican bill, anti-ESG bill that would basically keep fund managers from having that option. He vetoed it, tweeted a video of himself, even called out Marjorie Taylor Greene for some reason in the tweet. I just wonder to what extent, as we hear about woke banking, it's been a week of this now, maybe not as loud as it was last week. Do we have any reason to believe that ESG played into these bank collapses?
There's no indication that what we saw transpire in Silicon Valley Bank or Signature Bank was a direct result of investing in certain industries, which could be called woke or environmentally friendly or anything like that. It's going to continue to be very much a political issue, though. And now we're seeing that the President of the United States and the Democrats are going to play it as well. So here we are heading into what's going to be an increasingly contentious leading up to next year's election. And I think this banking crisis and certainly ESG investing is going to continue to be front and center.
That's the tweet now.
But this is what the president said today. Where was the president over the weekend? Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Fed Chair Jerome Powell, all they've come out with over the weekend was a 3-sentence statement. That's it. Do you think, Wendy, they're too invisible right now in this crisis?
I do think they are too invisible. One thing Americans want to hear, especially as we're heading into an election year, is that somebody's got their hand on the tiller. And while everyone is saying, not me, not me, it is interesting that just before I came in here, Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, put out talked to reporters some more and said, I said we didn't have anything to read out, but we are really working on this. So she clearly saw the headlines and felt the need to indicate that the White House was doing something. As we all know, Biden is very deliberative. It may take a little while, but who knows what's going to happen.
We get a reality check here just for a second. We're talking a lot. There's going to be a lot of hearings. We know when they start. Is this going to be a hearings to nowhere kind of situation in a divided Congress? Why do we have any reason to believe that Congress will get anything done?
Pressure from the public, pressure from the banking sector, maybe. I mean, there is this possibility to punish executives who run these failed banks. Right now, the House Freedom Caucus, which really does control what the House does, these are the conservative Republicans, they are saying absolutely not on lifting the FDIC deposit limit, while Senator Mark Warner, I'm sure he'll say this when he comes on in a little while, is now open to the idea. He's warming to the idea of it. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were there several days ago. But if the House Freedom Caucus says no, they actually have a tremendous amount of power in this Congress.
Yeah, they definitely do. We saw that in the speakership vote. Ben, the other individual name that was circulated over the weekend, behind closed doors, potential phone calls between the White House and Warren Buffett. Do you think potentially he could be some sort of white knight in this situation?
That's a big question, right? I mean, Warren Buffett, just kind of really gets everyone's imaginations going and what could actually happen. Where we are right now on Monday afternoons, essentially, we have 3 small regional banks that have collapsed. We have a bunch of others that are wobbling and people are concerned about. And there is this idea, is there some type of white knight, angel investor could come in and figure out some way to basically solve the situation. So the fact those conversations happen certainly, raises the specter, but, it's not clear that deal's, necessarily anywhere at this point.
Got to ask, I'll say both of you, Ben. I'll give you the option on this one. Donald Trump says he's going to get arrested tomorrow. I mean, how are we not talking about this? Ben, listen.
Ben is the first time he's
is there a bank involved? I don't know.
Actually, let's find out about that. Look, this is about Stormy Daniels. It's getting to be pretty wacky, as you can see. He says, protest, take our nation back. Wendy, we have no reason to believe an arrest will happen tomorrow, if it does happen.
Right.
But there are a lot of concerns about security surrounding this case now.
There are. And in fact, the New York Republicans are having a peaceful protest, they say, outside the New York courthouse in an hour, less than an hour now. Police have set up barricades. They've taken a lot of precautions. I think, on the other hand, we are seeing online people who might have been involved in January 6th saying, I'm not really sure I want to try this again. So it could be less than that. The thing is that this possible indictment, which I think we now know is not going to be tomorrow. It's very possible this week, but they have to tell his lawyers, give him a courtesy heads up, get him up to New York, all of that. But it's really to Trump's benefit to run as the victim of deep state and Democrats who are out to get him for what? For a crime that would be a misdemeanor, but Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, is trying to create a path to a felony.
How difficult has this made the other potential candidates going to 2024?
Oh, they're in a terrible pickle. I mean, we saw Ron DeSantis this morning
Finally break his silence.
Yeah, he did break his silence, and he said, he sort of teased Trump by saying, well, I don't know what it's like to pay, hush money to a porn star, which put him in a different moral camp, but then said he thinks it's wrong of Alvin Bragg to prosecute him. So he went with the Republican field on that.
Not a single Republican candidate can come out and say that they welcome this.
Right.
They have to get on that bandwagon, which only helps Trump. And he's campaigning.
Exactly. He's campaigning.
Will there be a perp walk, though? Can you see that?
I'm not going to speak to that.
I say not a chance.
Let's see what happens. But he will get fingerprinted. I mean,
sure.
It will happen.
The idea is, though, does you see an SUV going right down into the basement parking lot, or are they going to walk him in the front door?
He wants the video because that video will hit all social platforms, and that's the campaign dollars. All right. Our thanks to our panel today, Bloomberg's Ben Bain and Wendy Benjaminson, on this Monday morning, kicking off the week. Coming up next, First Republic Bank still in trouble despite the $30 billion deposit from 11 other banks last week. Now, Congress is looking at deposit insurance. Should it be lifted? That conversation next. This is Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. Stress in the banking system remains, with questions swirling about the future of First Republic. The backdrop to a wider conversation, especially one happening here in D.C., about which deposits should be insured. Kaylee Lyons is here with more. Hey, Kaylee.
Well, Anne-Marie, First Republic is just the poster child for the stresses that are remaining in the U.S. banking system. This is a stock that fell 47% today alone to a record low, now down 90% over the course of the last 2 weeks. The concern, of course, being here that it also has a more highly concentrated depositor base, much like we saw with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, which, of course, have both failed. Now, we saw last week an attempted rescue by 11 larger banks here in the U.S., giving First Republic $30 billion in deposits. We understand now that J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon is leading talks on potentially new aid that would take the form of those $30 billion in deposits being converted into a capital infusion. But none of that really seems to stick with market sentiment. And of course, market sentiment was further dented by S&P Global Ratings yesterday for the second time in less than a week, downgrading the credit rating of First Republic now to B+. So further into junk. The analysts there saying that $30 billion is not a longer-term solution to this bank's funding troubles. They think First Republic is going to have difficulty attracting meaningful deposits. And this deposit issue is one that resonates more widely in the U.S. banking system for these regional mid-sized lenders. How do you prevent flight of deposits from those banks into banks deemed too big to fail? This has been a conversation circulating here in Washington in recent weeks, and we heard from the Mid-Sized Bank Coalition of America writing to the FDIC over the weekend, asking them to insure all deposits for 2 years. They say doing so will immediately halt the exodus of deposits from smaller banks, stabilize the banking sector, and greatly reduce chances of more bank failures. They say confidence has been eroded in all but the largest banks, and that confidence in the banking system as a whole must be immediately restored. So that is one potential proposal. There is also just the broader question of, should that FDIC insurance cap be raised above the $250,000 where it now sits? We heard Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts talking about that on CBS yesterday.
I think that lifting the FDIC insurance cap is a good move. Now, the question is, where's the right number? This is a question we got to work through. Is it 2 million? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million?
So, Joe, as she says, they still have to work through it. But there is a question of if something like that could find bipartisan support in a divided Congress.
Kaylee, thank you so much. Kaylee Lyons reporting here on Balance of Power to shed a little more light on this FDIC matter, its bearing on the U.S. banking system. Is Robert Hockett, professor of law and public policy at Cornell, author of The Citizen's Ledger, Digitizing Our Money, Democratizing Our Finance. It's great to have you with us. You were ahead of your time, I think we can say, on lifting the cap on FDIC insurance here. But how do you lead a horse to water on this? This is a Congress that can't even agree on the debt limit or writing a budget for that matter. Do you actually see this passing both chambers?
I actually do, guys. I'm working with members of both chambers and both parties, and there's quite a bit of agreement, believe it or not. And I think the reasons are fairly straightforward. If you think about it, helping out the community banks in this particular way would come at no cost. I shouldn't say community, I'm sorry, regional banks in this way would come at no cost to the public on the one hand. It would actually essentially preserve a huge sector of our banking system and prevent it essentially from being gobbled up by the big four, right? By the TBTF or too big to fail Wall Street banks. Indeed, we could even spark something of a rebirth of our nation's industrial base, because back in the old days, when those banks' deposits were fully insured, they were the ones who led when it came to production in the primary markets rather than mere speculation on price movements in secondary financial and tertiary derivatives markets.
Professor, since you are speaking to all folks on both political aisles and the House and the Senate, what are you hearing in terms of lifting the FDIC insurance as a range and also the timeline? Would it be for 2 years or longer?
I'm noticing something very important. As soon as I convey to various Congress members a certain fact about the way the FDIC insurance fund is funded, they all become much more friendly to the idea, right? So the first step is telling them how important the regional banks are to the productive sectors of our economy, to the startups, to the small businesses, the small farms, and the like. And then the second thing that you tell them is that we have actually funded the Deposit Insurance Fund with risk-priced insurance premiums ever since 2005, right? The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Improvement Act of 2005 vastly improved the way in which we actually fund the fund. And we simply charge premiums to the banks, right, in order to get that insurance. And we sensibly price them in the sense that health insurance, of course, is more expensive for you if you smoke a pack of cigarettes a day or an hour than it is if you eat kale and live healthy. And similarly, if you're insuring a big Beverly Hills mansion with homeowners insurance, that's going to cost you more than if you're insuring a little Ithaca cottage worth $200,000 in Ithaca, New York, as I do. And so all you have to do is price the insurance correctly, and then it's not particularly risky to the public sector. Another thing that has to be borne in mind here is that what we're dealing with is self-fulfilling prophecies. These are not banks that are fundamentally unsound. In fact, Silicon Valley Bank wasn't fundamentally unsound. It was in some ways the classic boring bank of the sort that Paul Krugman and many Republicans called for over 2008. All of its loans were made in the tech sector. These were basically garden variety business loans for productive expansion. They were all performing, no delinquencies or toxicities of the kind that we talked about in 2008. And then the rest of the portfolio was essentially the Fed portfolio. These were all Treasury securities on the one hand and AAA rated MBS on the other. So essentially what happened to SVB was there was a run of that self-fulfilling prophecy variety as people suddenly realized how much of their deposits weren't insured. One final thing in this connection, we think of 250K as fine or as enough if we're thinking about our personal bank accounts. But the thing to remember is that productive companies, firms, startups, small businesses, small family farms, and the like have large payrolls and large daily operating expenses. And for those businesses, 250K is chump change. For our personal expenses, it's plenty. It's more than enough for me. But for a business, it's chump change. And likewise for a nonprofit or any other sort of entity that has a big operating budget.
Professor, I spoke earlier today with Bill Huizenga, a Republican from Michigan. He actually was joining me from the Republican retreat down in Orlando, where this is a big topic of conversation. I asked him specifically, he serves on the Financial Services Committee, specifically about this issue of raising the cap on insurance. He used the word temporarily frequently in our conversation. Listen to how he put it.
I'm coming to the consensus that we may have to look at a temporary increase of that, or maybe even fully guaranteeing all of those deposits for a temporary basis while we sort through some of these things.
Yeah. We had a pretty wide-ranging conversation today on Bloomberg Radio. With that in mind, let's say there is a temporary increase. Does that mask the greater problem? It gets us through the crisis, and then Congress ends up doing nothing as a result. Does this need to be addressed on a permanent basis right now?
I think temporary would be fine for the time being, because, again, the key thing to remember here is that this is just basically people who are quite jittery when they suddenly realize that large portions of their deposits, or I should say businesses are jittery, when they realize that large portions of their deposits are uninsured. And so they're momentarily frightened. And you can certainly address that fear with a temporary lifting of the cap. We can always then revisit in a couple of years, and maybe at that point, when we're not sort of in stress, we'll see the wisdom of doing that permanently. A lot of people forget forget that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address, when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he said that right before essentially introducing the nation's first deposit insurance system. And there was a link between those two things. He wasn't simply engaging in a kind of rhetorical flourish. He meant quite literally the fear that we had to fear was fear itself, because fear was driving people to pull their money out of banks that were fundamentally sound. And there was no reason for them to be doing so, ultimately, not fundamentally. It was all because you have to be first in the queue if there is going to be a run, because of the business model of banks, which essentially borrow short term and lend long term, right? But so the thing about deposit insurance, it's a little bit like kind of nuclear arms or weapons stockpiling. You basically do it in order not to have to use it, and that's the way it's worked, right? Before we got large accounts that were beyond the current limits, which are archaic and obsolete, essentially vestigial, kind of like the human tailbone. Before they became archaic and obsolete in that way, that system worked perfectly, precisely because it's meant to prevent the thing from even starting.
Robert Hockett, thank you so much for joining us, especially since you are giving so much of your insight to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. We'll see what they have to say. Professor of Law at Cornell University, Robert Hockett there. Up next, TikTok in the crosshairs on Capitol Hill. We'll speak with a senator whose legislation has the okay from the White House. Senator Mark Warner is just ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
I just signed this veto because the legislation passed by the Congress would put at risk the retirement savings of individuals across the country. They couldn't take into consideration investments that wouldn't be impacted by climate, impacted by overpaying executives, and that's why I decided to veto it. It makes sense to veto it.
President Joe Biden explaining the decision to use his veto power for the first time since taking office. Joe, obviously the first time because the last 2 years, it was not a divided Congress.
Nothing to veto.
Are we going to be expecting more of these?
Well, it's a good question. And I guess, number one, not only what made him choose to make an example out of this, but what also caused Republicans to send that bill to him, knowing that it would be vetoed. Everybody's trying to make a point here. And ESG is right in the middle of everything that we've been talking about lately. It's being blamed by some for some bank collapses, and it's being heralded by progressives as the way forward.
And I think you have a good point, since why did the Republicans want to exactly do this? Under the Trump administration, you could still consider climate change in those investments, right. But it was under the Biden administration where it made it explicit. Yeah. So much of this is about 2024.
Here we are. It's campaign season. Coming up, Virginia Senator Mark Warner joins the conversation. He'll be with us here on Balance of Power to talk banks, the budget, and his proposed legislation that could lead to a TikTok ban. That's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Welcome. House conservatives said they would oppose any universal guarantee of bank deposits above the current $250,000 FDIC insurance cap, even as other lawmakers say they are weighing a statutory increase in the limit following the two recent bank collapses. We've been talking about this quite a bit for the last half hour here, and we want to add another voice to this. Mark Warner, Democratic senator from Virginia, who has a unique perspective here. Senator, thanks for joining us. There have been calls growing louder to lift the cap on FDIC insurance. Some Democrats, including your colleague from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, says the sky's the limit. You've been tapping the brakes a little bit on this conversation. Where is your caution based in lifting that cap on insurance?
First of all, let's look back historically. After the financial crisis, we lifted the cap on protecting deposits from 2008 till 2012. The question I have, and I'm open to it, but I want to get the facts first on what caused this. In my gut, I believe this was a basic banking regulator 101 failure, the fact that, and a management failure, but I want to confirm that, the fact that you didn't get interest rate management right. But when you start raising the caps, I don't know where you top it off, 250 to 500, 500 to $1 million. If you're a mid-sized bank and you've got a lot of corporate deposits, even $1 million's not going to be enough. So, is there a private insurance model that could insure above that? Is there an FDIC model that could have greater fees? I get the fact that if we stay at 250, this kind of middle market sayers of banks, that basic business model may be upended. But I don't think, my hope and prayer would be, and I've talked to a lot of my Republican Senate friends, guys, just, don't get locked into a position until we get the facts.
But Senator Warner, we know how long facts can take to get through Congress. Us journalists are also trying to figure out what exactly went wrong. Isn't the moment to act? Wouldn't it be now to fend off an exodus of all this money out of these smaller regional banks?
Well, let's put this into three categories. We've got the small community banks where the vast majority of their deposits are under 250, under 250,000. They're going to be fine. You got the large SIFI banks, the top 5 or 6. They're going to be fine. It is this model on the regional basis that about where the deposit insurance ought to end is a fair question. I want to get a little more time, talk to a number more folks. I think what I've heard, and I think Michael Barr at the Fed is the right guy to do this investigation. He's supposed to have he's supposed to have a report actually done in 6 weeks. We're already a week into it, so 5 weeks. I get concerned when folks on either side of the aisle rush forward with a pre-canned solution before they see what were the circumstances. We know here that there were some mistakes. It appears, at least, that mistakes. There was no risk officer at the bank for 8 of the last 12 months. Where was the basic prudential safety and soundness regulator? Because my view is whether this was a $5 billion bank or a $500 billion bank, if you got your interest rate risks wrong, that is a challenge. But there was also something else unprecedented. And I think your audience would get this more than most. If you look back at other bank failures, WAMU, one of the largest ever, that was a bank run that took place $16 billion over 10 days. In this case, you got a bank that was highly concentrated in my old industry, technology, where a group of VCs on the Wednesday night before the Thursday run basically did the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. And the next day, $42 billion went out of that bank in 5 or 6 hours. That was the equivalent of 25 cents on every dollar of deposits. I don't know what capital standards or liquidity ratio can slow that kind of run. Now, again, what does that mean in terms of level of protection going forward? You get into a lot of kind of gnarly issues if you're talking about slowing the flow of money going out the way we sometimes do in the market on trading. But this kind of unprecedented run, clearly, at least I believe, irresponsible, self-serving action by a couple of folks, particularly some of these VCs who love to say they are, libertarian until the stuff hits the fan, and then they desperately want government assistance. But we ought to get the facts first, and then whatever we have to do. And one of the issues, and you guys have nailed it, is where do you set a deposit insurance level that slows a run, but doesn't end up with a huge moral hazard issue?
Well, while you're fact-finding, Senator, we've got a Fed meeting that starts tomorrow. I wonder how worried you are about a rate hike. Some suggest no hike would spook the markets even more. But what's more important to you right now? Dealing with the aftermath of this banking crisis, finding stability, or beating inflation?
I would hope the Fed would take a pause. Now, and I've been generally supportive of the Fed. I think, they're going to, damned if they do, damned if they don't. But I think, what the Fed is trying to do is slow growth. And clearly this banking crisis and the uncertainty it's created, especially a lot of the growth companies around the country, the startup companies, and some of the insecurity that's in these regional banks, I think that is going to be as every bit as much of a slowing on the economy as another 25 basis point rate hike.
Senator, I want to ask you where your TikTok bill stands right now. We know it has the okay from the White House. Have you spoken to leadership in the Senate about when potentially we could see this bill hit the floor?
Well, I keep picking up more bipartisan senators. I got 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats. We've had outreach from House Republicans. And I think why people are coming to this legislation is because our current approach on foreign technology from countries like China and Russia, Iran, is kind of whack-a-mole. We dealt with Kaspersky, a Russian software company, about 5 or 6 years ago. We dealt with Huawei, a Chinese telecom company. Now we're talking about TikTok. So my bill would have a rules-based approach that I believe would stand up in court, giving the Secretary of Commerce the ability to have all kinds of tools. You could have divestiture, you could put limitations, you could go all the way up to ban. And why I think TikTok is a national security threat is really twofold. One, 150 million Americans. It's very popular. I don't underestimate that. 90 minutes a day on average. They are collecting data on all of those Americans. And regardless of what TikTok or its Chinese owner ByteDance says, that China doesn't have access to that data, that's just not the case. Chinese law requires every company to turn over data to the Communist Party if requested. So the data loss is huge. The other issue is 90 minutes a day. I bet you wish all Bloomberg viewers would spend 90 minutes a day on your network. You know,
you don't know they don't.
They may. The hardcore will. But you know, the ability to have that data or that content manipulated. Think about the propaganda tool. Think about if she says, okay, we want to make sure young Americans have a view that Taiwan is totally a part of China, and if China takes it over, no big deal. And you know, and it's not. Let me just be clear. One last point is that it's not just what we're doing in Congress. Canada has taken the same approach in terms of government phones. The British recently did. The Dutch said to their media folks, if you got TikTok, get it off. And India banned the whole app a couple years ago.
Well, you've got the backing of the White House here, Senator, which is pretty important. To get back to Anne Marie's question, though, do you have any sense of when this gets to the floor? Are we going to see a vote on this?
It's. I like the backing of the White House, but I got to make sure I got backing of my House Republican friends, too. So navigating that is part of the sausage making. I think as we continue to attract attention, I think this bill has a very good shot of becoming law. And I think putting in place, and remember, this is not just about TikTok. This is about a rules-based approach. And on communication technologies, there's a higher legal standard. You know, TikTok's got a right to have a day in court as a company that has communication services in America. So you've got to do this in a thoughtful way. Our legislation would also apply to, you know, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, quantum computing, a host of other technology domains where I think our competition with China is only going to get more fierce.
You mentioned House Republicans. Have you spoken to Speaker McCarthy about what his camp would need and potentially their version of this bill that would line up with yours?
I will simply say that Speaker McCarthy's public comments about this legislation have been very favorable. And, you know, we are, along with my lead Republican partner, John Thune, are engaging with the House, both on the Democratic and Republican side. I mean, this is not a bill that's trying to, you know, do a show bill. This is a bill that's actually trying to become law. And I'd add one more point just to kind of make the case. President Xi, this is, I think, an interesting point, in China, has said that he may want to ban TikTok in America, rather than giving up the algorithm, the secret sauce that's so powerful and so seducing to so many TikTok viewers. I mean, that in itself speaks volumes about how he views the power of that source code.
Senator Mark Warner, thank you so much for your time. That was Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. Of course, we'll be keeping an eye on his TikTok bills. It does have the Biden administration's backing. Coming up on this program, former President Trump is facing the possibility of an arrest over allegations of hush money payments. We'll dive into the reaction from politicians in Washington and beyond. That's coming up after the break.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. The French government survived 2 non-confidence motions today to enable the immediate adoption of President Emmanuel Macron's unpopular pension reform bill without holding a full vote in Parliament. The first motion got 278 votes, only 9 short of the 287 needed to topple the prime minister. The second got 94. The reform includes raising France's minimum retirement age by 2 years to 64. It faces continued pushback from opposition lawmakers and further street marches, which have sometimes turned violent. The UN is issuing another dire warning about the threat from the worst effects of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the world is likely to go past the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold in the near term. It says widespread and rapid changes to planetary systems have already taken place, and to avoid the worst outcomes, the world would need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2035. More job cuts on the way at Amazon. Another 9,000 jobs are being eliminated following 18,000 layoffs that began in November at the tech giant. Amazon CEO Andy Jassy said the cuts are needed because of what he called the uncertain economy. The e-commerce company has been laying off mostly corporate workers after a hiring spree during the pandemic. In Miami Beach, a state of emergency has been declared and a curfew imposed after 2 fatal shootings involving spring break crowds. The killings took place in the city's Ocean Drive Entertainment District. Miami Beach Mayor Dan Gelber said, "We don't want spring break in our city." Global news, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Now, former President Donald Trump took to his Truth Social platform over the weekend to say he's bracing for an arrest in a probe by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Joining us to discuss this are Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, professor of political science at Iona University. Welcome, everyone. Obviously, we all saw the Truth Social post. I was going to say a tweet. He's still not on Twitter just yet. And then we saw all the remarks from potential candidates or the Republicans. And the Trump campaign really was waiting for one individual to break his silence, and that was Governor DeSantis. Take a listen to how he did just that.
Look, I don't know what goes into paying hush money to a porn star to secure silence over some type of alleged affair. I can't speak to that. But what I can speak to is that if you have a prosecutor who is ignoring crimes happening every single day in his jurisdiction, and he chooses to go back many, many years ago to try to use something about porn star hush money payments, that's an example of pursuing a political agenda and weaponizing the office.
I think that was probably the best Governor DeSantis was going to get, right? He made his point, but he really drew out what the issue at hand was.
Oh, yeah. This was the most sarcastic DeSantis you're ever going to see. Pox on both your houses, right? I'm going to, really talk a lot about the, awful thing that you did, Donald Trump. And then I'm going to go after the prosecutor for prosecuting you for those awful things that you did. And I must admit, it kind of made him likable. You heard there a little bit of laughing in the press conference. People sort of got a kick out of it. But it was his way of sending a very clear message to Donald Trump. And frankly, much more clear than any other presidential candidate I've seen, other than Chris Christie, who just berates him all, Donald Trump all the time. But DeSantis really used the opportunity well, I thought.
Jeannie, Lindsey Graham said over the weekend that the DA in this case has done more to help Donald Trump's candidacy than anyone in America has or could have. Is he right?
No, I don't think Lindsey Graham is right about that. This does help Donald Trump with fundraising, certainly. It's going to help him stay relevant. He was all over the news all weekend. We're all watching his Truth Social. It may help him win the primary, but who this really helps is this really helps Joe Biden if he decides to run in a general election.
Why? How?
The same way it helped the Democrats in 2022. Nothing, and quite frankly, Joe Biden in 20. Nothing gets Joe Biden support from independents and moderates needed to win these elections than putting Trump on the ballot. The last thing, and this is why most Republican senators are running away from this, the last thing Republicans want to do right now or should want to do is talk about Donald Trump. When he forces it, this is why they have such narrow numbers in the House and lost the Senate, and Joe Biden is in the White House. So it's a big win for Joe Biden, not so much for the Republican Party overall.
Yeah, and the Republican Party this weekend is in Orlando. They're at this retreat. And what's the first question Speaker McCarthy has to address? And that's the former president.
Yeah, and the former president, who he has yet to endorse to run for president, which is pretty interesting considering he himself says that Donald Trump probably the main reason why he got to be speaker. So where's the quid pro quo there? Look, I think this is, I agree with Jeannie. I think this is very helpful to Joe Biden if he chooses to run for president, because it just reminds everybody that, hey, we kind of like some of the policies that Trump had during his presidential campaign. We just hated all this noise, and this is noise. This means the presidency. This is a distraction to getting people elected down ballot. And the hope that a lot of Republicans have is that all that noise just goes away. Donald Trump is not going away.
And Rick and Jeannie, we do have that sound from McCarthy over the weekend. This really had to do with the protests. Take a listen.
I don't think people should protest this, no. And I think President Trump, if you talk to him, he doesn't believe that either. I mean, I think the thing that you may misinterpret when President Trump talks, when someone says that they can protest, he would probably be referring to my tweet, educate people about what's going on. He's not talking in a harmful way, and nobody should.
That's what I figured as well when I read that. He was talking about education, Jeannie. Of course, in all caps, protest, exclamation point, in the wake of January 6th might also be interpreted in a different way.
Yeah, and poor McCarthy, right? Anne Marie said the first question. It was also the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. I mean, it was, right. I think somebody counted half the questions he got. They're trying to have a policy retreat about all the things they've done and want to do, and it's Trump 24/7. And of course, then he has to, bend himself into a pretzel to try to explain that the protests, as we learned from January 6th, are actually a call for a peaceful educational moment in the country. Nobody's going to believe it, but this is where Kevin McCarthy finds himself, and this is the problem for Republicans in purple districts, is that this does not play well in those districts, and so he's trying to once again walk this line. Donald Trump just won't let him go. Poor Kevin McCarthy.
Well, make no mistake, the barriers are going up in front of the courthouse in New York either way. Coming up, Rick and Jeannie, stay with us as we look to the political response to Chinese President Xi's visit to Russia this week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
We hope that President Xi will press President Putin to cease bombing Ukrainian cities, hospitals, and schools, to halt the war crimes and atrocities, and to withdraw all its troops. But we are concerned that, instead, China will reiterate calls for a ceasefire that leaves Russian forces inside Ukraine's sovereign territory.
That was National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby a bit earlier today in the White House briefing room, as we are back with our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, seeing the optics. And they rolled out the red carpet for Xi today, Rick. The band was playing, the tarmac reception, and the whole bit. This is a 3-day, as China puts it, journey of friendship. Is the White House watching quietly here? Does anything short of a weapons deal draw a response from the administration?
Oh, I'm sure there'll be a response, not from this administration alone, but from the entire Western world, because this is something that will impact the world writ large, right? We are obviously one of the major players, especially in the conflict in the Ukraine, which this is essentially really what it's all about. But you're right, state visit by President Xi, and to talk about peace. Well, Xi's version of peace is to claim the entire South China Sea is a pond of the, Chinese Communist Party. Yeah. And so why in the world would we think that he would want to see Russian troops leave Ukraine? So you consider the source, right, when you're dealing with these kinds of peace plans.
We also have Kirby talking about the fact he was asked in the briefing room about this. When is Biden going to have this call? Has it been delayed? And Admiral Kirby said he's been busy. He had the People's Congress, and now he's in Moscow. But should the Biden administration be giving Xi Jinping a call on the heels of this trip to Russia?
I tend to favor communication most of the time. And so I do think, timing is important. They may want to wait a little bit. But I do think the more there is communication between these two countries, the better. And so I would favor that. But I think we cannot, underscore enough how important this visit of Xi to Putin in Russia is Xi is trying to set himself up as a diplomatic leader, a political leader of the kind that China has not been. It has been an economic superstar in the world. But now with the Middle East, where the negotiation occurred, now he's in Ukraine. We're seeing the same things in Africa. We cannot underestimate what he is trying to do. This is an autocratic alliance they are trying to put together to counter the West. And we have to take that very, very seriously. I think Joe Biden has known that since before his presidency, so he's well placed to do this. But the administration has got to be tough on what they see come out of this meeting.
Yeah, certainly a lot more is going to be coming up on that as that visit rounds out. Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, professor of political science at Iona University. Thank you so much for joining us. That does it for Joe and I today. But, of course, all these stories and more will be in the Balance of Power newsletter. That's on the terminal and online. Coming up tomorrow, I believe we have a senator from Maryland. That's right, Ben Cardin. That's coming up.
That does it for us here in Washington. We'll see you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.